This week's work of the week is Benjamin Britten's suite on English folk tunes, entitled A Time There Was. Britten had earlier completed a very small piece for woodwind written for the opening of the Queen Elizabeth Hall called Hankin Booby. And eventually he got round to, or was persuaded to write a whole suite using English folk tunes. In fact, there are 5 movements, and he uses 2 English folk tunes per movement. Britten had already written the movement for woodwind, so what would be more natural than to have a movement for strings? And this is Hunt the Squirrel, which was actually just written for the violin section. And it's always very amusing in our first rehearsal where the orchestra aren't particularly expecting this to come along. Well, the violins know it's coming, and the violins plough through this very jolly folk fiddle style movement, and they always get a huge round of applause from the rest of the orchestra at the end. It's a real sort of showpiece for the fiddle section. Another interesting movement is the Bitter Withy, based on a folk song about Jesus as a child getting into trouble and being struck, being beaten with a withy, a willow stick by his mother. And Britten really orchestrates this beautifully, because you can hear the moment where things turn sour, where Jesus has been bad, and you can actually hear in the orchestration him being whipped, and you hear the harp in a very quick glissando downwards through all of the strings, and then the double basses play with their sticks of the bow on the strings of their instruments. So it sounds like a whip, a really hard hit of this bitter withy, this willow stick. And the last movement, called Lord Melbourne, is actually the only one that quotes a whole folk melody, and it was collected by Percy Grainger, I think, or at least notated by Percy Grainger, to whom the suite is dedicated. And this melody is played by the cor anglais, perhaps the most plaintive, melancholic instrument there is. And it's rather touching that Britten, I think by that stage, having had heart surgery, realises that the end is coming, and he resigns himself perhaps to the fact that he faces his own mortality. And it's a really touching ending. It's the longest movement, and it's waving goodbye to something. The cor anglais just vanishes into thin air with a very mournful melody, and you just hear the last couple of notes played by the flute, a little memory and echo. And it's rather touching the way that it seems that Britten is just waving goodbye to life and to good times.